hey, I was looking at the GDPR stuff, and I was like, okay, either I screwed something up royally, or he wants to change a lot of things, and he's asking my permission.
At
And so,
7 p.m.
yeah, so he
Is
was
this
like,
after? Oh, this was earlier or later today.
yeah, this was just a little bit ago. We were just
Okay.
talking like 30 minutes ago, and he was like, I figured out a way to do such and such in this area, and you don't have to touch this area at all. And I was like, okay, Joe, that's cool. And he was like he kept kind of like stating the question as a statement, and then finally he was like, I'm gonna make the changes. That's not gonna make you mad, right? And I was like, if you're making the changes, it's probably for the better, man. Go for it.
I was gonna start testing that in the morning.
Oh well, it's about to be completely different apparently.
Alrighty, so let's see. What are we talking about? Anti-patterns? Am I yelling again?
No, I think you're good.
Okay. Blowing your eardrums.
You were just excited.
I'm just excited about anti-patterns. So Jack, since this was your suggestion, you can like start it and define and whatnot and get us rolling.
So I'll start with defining what a design pattern is. It's a basic and sort of generic solution to a recurring problem. If you've got X problem, you can use one of a few design patterns to solve that problem. I mean, there's no mental effort, just implement that pattern. An anti-pattern is it's sort of the same thing. There's a common recurring problem, but the pattern you choose to implement is not good. Either it's too complex or it may only appear to be working when it's still kind of broken. So it's common patterns that are just bad. You guys agree with that?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. I was expecting you to just read it straight from the wiki, the definition on the wiki, like we've done for the past whatever. But
It's a
that's good.
common response to recur. Hey, I use those words.
Yeah, I think the definition that's on wiki is a little verbose and super technical definition.
I think one of the good words that the wiki description uses is it's counterproductive.
Yeah, the way I would put it in my own words is it's something that commonly occurs and initially looks like a good idea. And that's kind of the reason why it commonly occurs is because initially it looks like a good idea, but then in the long run it turns out to have more cons than pros.
Yeah, it solves your problem, but in of itself is a problem.
Right. And then the second part of that definition that they have on wiki was another solution exists that is documented and repeatable and proven to be effective.
Yep.
Which would be your design patterns that are like in the software development world, everyone should kind of know about. And if not, it's one of like the first things you should probably look into.
So like Omar said, we did just find the Wikipedia page for anti-patterns, and there's a good list of them. It's probably not comprehensive, but we're gonna focus on the software engineering ones, not the business operations ones.
Right. So you just want to start at the top of the list, or are there some that you're itching to talk about?
I thought we would go through every section top to bottom, and then if that takes a few days to get through, maybe we'll take those days.
All right.
I'll take a crack at the first one. So the first one on this Wikipedia page is abstraction inversion. So you're looking at a library or a class. It's got functionality inside of it that you want to use. You're trying to leverage that code, but the code hasn't made that functionality accessible for some reason. I don't really know how you would get to this point in reality, but the result is that whoever is trying to use this library or class has to go re-implement all that functionality in their own code. And I think in many cases, their own code is going to be a higher level than maybe the library or class that you're trying to use. And so it's going to be necessarily less efficient. And chances are you've got tons of people trying to call this same functionality, and they're all writing their own version, and there's just going to be bugs everywhere.
Optimistic at heart. I like that.
Did I get that right?
Yeah, that's more or less what I got
Okay.
out of it.
Yeah.
And so it's called abstraction inversion. So there was supposed to be abstraction, but it's working in reverse, or I don't know.
Yeah, there's a set of abstraction, but some subset of that is not exposed, and that's the part that people apparently need and have to rewrite themselves.
Yeah, and one of the examples on the wiki was one that I found kind of useful in understanding it was the there was basically some API that didn't abstract how to do some kind of arithmetic. I think it was this one. There's no bitwise operators not supported for rasterizing graphics. So basically, at a high level, they had to re-implement that, which had worse performance than the actual lower level implementation of it. Whereas if they would have just opened the API to allow use of that more performant implementation.
And to clarify on this one, it's not an anti-pattern for you to rewrite that functionality that's not exposed. It's an anti-pattern to not expose it, in my opinion.
Correct.
Yeah, it's basically an abstraction that doesn't open up enough of the interface.
Yeah, maybe you didn't realize it was something that everyone, for some reason or another, you didn't think this was something that everyone that used this would need.
Right.
And it turns out they all did.
Yeah. And in some cases that could be as easy as an easy fix as where you just add public to a method, or you add a method to the interface. But in others, depending on the implementation, it could be as difficult to fix as completely rewriting a class because of the way it's intertwined and stuff.
I guess if you're working with proprietary software and this code is how you make your money, maybe it makes sense, and people are just trying to reverse engineer it. I mean, it makes sense from a business standpoint, not a software standpoint.
All right, are you good with that one?
Yeah.
All right, so next one, I'll take the next one, I guess. Ambiguous viewpoint. I wasn't ready for this one. I don't think I. So when I read through this, I kind of read them, tried to understand them, and only really dug into the ones that I thought that I actually saw often. That I see in the course of a month, I usually see one of these or something like that, or I've caught myself doing one of these. So
okay.
I think ambiguous viewpoint might have been one of those where I kind of just skipped over. Someone else have a better?
I think I do. Justin?
Okay.
Oh, go for it. If you have
okay. So the viewpoint in this case is from what context are you calling this object or model from? Are you calling it from the business perspective, or is there a data perspective? So you have data models, you've got your your business logic models, and so if you write a model and it's not clear which context that model is supposed to be used for, then it's ambiguous. So the viewpoint is the context.
Okay. Is that good? Do we need to talk about that one more?
Yeah, I don't think so.
Okay. I think it's maybe kind of similar to in the next section. There's an anemic domain model anti-pattern. I think these might be kind of the same.
Yeah, the anemic domain model is kind of an interesting one because there's people on both sides of the fence on that. There's some people who consider it an anti-pattern and some that don't.
And so I guess repercussion, if I can go back to the ambiguous viewpoint, is if you've got a data model, don't implement business logic. If you've got like a business logic model / class, don't implement your data model code. They should be separate.
Yeah, you said basically separation of concern. So your low level implementation of squaring, let's just say squaring a number, shouldn't know what the high level usage of that method's going to be, basically. That makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so the next one, big ball of mud.
Oh, this one's easy.
Yeah. To me, I can't believe, or I want to believe, this isn't something that exists in like people's production.
Yeah, I mean, to me, this is one I also skipped over just because I feel like it exists and it's common, but only in like solo developer or like
Maybe.
I don't see it happening in like a big production ready product that actually has multiple developers and like people constantly looking at it and reviewing it. I mean,
yeah, unless it's something that the scenario that I guess comes to mind is you're like rapid prototyping something, and somebody's like, oh, okay, this is perfect. So we can kind of drop it in place as is, and then we'll come back and touch it back over. That's not something we've ever done, but I can see that being a scenario where somebody's just like, hey, look what I did, and they're like, oh, that's actually pretty cool. Let's see if we can get it in there, and you're kind of pigeonholing it into something.
yeah, so I could see this happening in like a big company if it's like a new product that they're trying to like get out quick and just
I would
it's
even
fresh out the ground and there's only 1 or 2 developers on it or something like that.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's a big company though. I can see it when it like very small teams that are having rapid growth might like throw something together and be like, well, okay, get it out there.
Yeah, and it's kind of like in this wiki it even says it common in practice due to business pressure, developer turnover, and code entropy. Code entropy, but I'm guessing just like multiple developers trying to change things in it.
Yeah.
Just to fix things and completely redesigning parts of the code.
Yeah.
And losing any kind of architecture or design that the project started off with.
Like every quarter you redesign like a fraction of the code.
Well, no, not even redesign, just like you
layer in.
You just change it just to fix something, but you break the original architecture, the original intent. Yeah. So big ball mud is basically no structure, no recognizable architecture, basically.
Yep.
All right. So the next one, database as IPC. This one's a pretty simple one.
I think we're guilty of this.
A little bit. I mean, but this one to me feels like
oh yeah. Yeah, maybe we are.
Yeah, it's like I feel like you can't generalize this. Like you can't say anytime you need to do IPC, don't use a database or don't use some type of. I mean, we're not actually using. I don't think this actually means a database. It just means don't like write to a file versus using a socket or some kind of
like
process to process communication.
A SQLite database that you literally write to just that some other thing can watch it, pick it up.
Yeah, or even as simple as a file or.
Yeah. Okay. I agree with you at first where I thought we kind of did this, but now I completely take that back and think no. I mean, we technically, I guess, kind of use the database as a means of communication, but we don't because we're using the database as a means of storage, and then updates to like object information are queued at a interval, and then sometimes changes occur, but we don't set something in the database and that forces a change. It's just
I'm wondering if this strictly means like actual databases, not like files for system, like for just simple status values, or
because we do direct connection for a lot of things too. I mean, we do like remote connection to computers to do what have you. But there are definitely situations where we do direct connect to devices to do changes. So yeah, okay, I changed my mind. I don't think we really do this.
Okay. Anything to add on that one? All right. So the next one, gold plating. I feel like I tend to do this a lot when I'm working on projects on my own, and
Yeah,
gets in the way of progress.
I was thinking you tend to do this too. It's crazy.
Do what?
I said I was thinking you tend to do this too.
Oh yeah.
Now that you mention it, I mean, the Android player does retry to download app update packages. You don't need to fix it. It works.
That was someone entered that bug and I had to fix
You
it.
entered it. I swear you entered it.
No, it was not. You can look at it tomorrow.
Okay.
This has to be things like I think where this would be the most visible is if you're doing a new feature that involves a user interface and you're like tweaking, like you're rounding text box edges and you're making borders a certain exact pixel, or like all these little small tweaks that.
Oh, see, when I was thinking about this, I was thinking just like refactoring, like continuing to refactor code, like to make it look cleaner and nicer.
It could be anything.
Yeah, continuing to work without adding actual functionality or adding new features or improving the. Well, you might be improving, but you're not adding any value to the product.
Yeah. I think everybody does this from time to time. That's just a standard. You want it to be as good as possible, and sometimes you just go overboard.
Yeah, because you take pride in what you're doing, and so it's almost kind of like a reflection on you as a developer. But
yeah, I feel like this happens a lot whenever I look at my old code. It's hard to not go back and be like, I need to fix that, because looking at it with fresh eyes, like I should not have done that.
You need a pattern of like constant revarnishing, where every time you see your old code, you're like, oh, but nope, and you go and
it could have been the greatest thing like a month ago when I looked at it, but now looking at it with fresh eyes, I'm like, what was I thinking?
After 5 years, you're no longer adding new features. You're just rewriting the ones you've already written.
So I think we're gold plating this gold plating anti-pattern.
Maybe.
So the next one, inner platform effect.
I couldn't really understand this one, but some of the examples that page gave was, let's say you've got a proper SQL database, and you just have one table, and you've got an ID column, a name column, and a value column, and your value column is just like extraordinarily long. So you're using SQL, but then you're kind of recreating SQL in your application to parse those three columns. Another example that the page gave was if you have an XML file, you have everything is just called item and value. And then inside item or value, there's a ton of data it's not organized data, but your application does all the organization, and you're just re-implementing XML.
Interesting. Okay, I can see that.
That's what I got from it.
Yeah, I feel like we kind of do this, but it's kind of hard not to do this in some scenarios where, well, I guess
I don't think we do this.
Well, so
if anything, I wouldn't say we over normalize by any means. We could there are definitely some tables we could normalize and split out, but there are no situations in our database where we blob data in a column.
Well, this isn't specifically databases or it's making software in such a generic form that it's mimicking what the platform it's written on. So take, for instance, in C#, you can write a program that takes C# code as an input and recompiles it and runs it for you. So a perfect example of this inner platform effect, I think, is you create like a Windows form application, and it's basically you have this big text box, rich text box, where you can type in C# code. and then it has a little window at the bottom that shows you the output of running that C# code. You're basically making a bad replica of C#.
So it's a very
you're putting a really thin wrapper around the platform that you're writing on.
This is a very specific way to reinvent the wheel.
Yeah. Well, it's reinventing the
Kinda,
wheel
yeah.
so that your wheel turns.
Yeah, it's so maybe
I think the database example was actually the most clear. Like
Yeah.
the way you described it is like storing a blob and then having to essentially parse the blob once you've made a call on the database to load that data. It's why did you bother? You should just have added more columns.
It's quote more portable.
Yeah, it's basically taking a program or a product and making it extremely configurable and extremely generic to the point where there's no custom code, basically. Like it's all just wrappers on top of calls to the underlying platform.
This is an interesting word for the next one. Input kludge.
Yeah, I think there's some debate on how to say it, but we'll go with kludge.
Would they say kludge?
I think so. I've heard people say kludge.
Sure. I'll take that one too.
Sounds cooler.
Type of failure in software where simple user input is not handled. So requesting a username, I guess, and then and then doing nothing with that information. Or another example is essentially taking in input but not putting any set restrictions on that input. So if you get weird characters, it blows up.
That doesn't. I feel like this one doesn't really fall into like the anti-pattern definition. It's just bad coding.
Yeah,
I can agree with that actually.
Yeah,
I think so too. I think that's just poor development, not it. I wouldn't even call that anti-pattern. I agree. Failing to specify and implement the handling of possible invalid. Okay, so that simple one-liner that describes it is not the way they technically describe it when you click on the page. Failing to specify and implement the handling of possibly invalid input. So writing poor unit tests is what input kludge is.
So not writing code is an anti-pattern.
Yeah, it's the anti-pattern to writing code, man. Okay, yeah, skip.
Yeah, okay. Interface bloat.
I don't know what this one means.
This is adding way too many methods to a single interface that should probably be 2, 3, 4 interfaces wide. So it's you make an interface so that you can split off certain methods into certain chunks, let's say. But then you think, oh, well, I also need this method. Oh, but I can also use this method. And in the end, every single method you needed has been added to one interface. And it no longer is a subset of definitions of like a type of method, if that makes sense. You would do all your CRUD operations in one interface, but then maybe all your, I don't know, let's say rendering or saving operations, I don't know, in another one. And instead you put that all in one interface, which makes no sense.
Yeah, this one's kind of really similar to the, well, a lot of these kind of go hand in hand, and it's hard to kind of separate them in my head, at least. But yeah, so an interface is used basically to not put a dependency on the caller or to do something without having an actual explicit dependency on something. So it's like to decouple stuff. And if you put a bunch of stuff in that interface, then you're kind of coupled to all that stuff now, or you have all that stuff without really needing it.
You put too many methods in there, and maybe only 2 of the classes that are implemented that interface actually need half of those.
Yeah. I don't see myself running across this too often, the interface bloat.
So what a basic...
Because usually when you create an interface, you're usually creating it with a specific goal in mind, and usually have a set of methods, like a handful of methods that you already know ahead of time you're going to put in the interface.
Yeah.
And then as you need them, you might add them, but
maybe that's where it would come in is, you think, oh, this one object could use this thing. I'll just go ahead and throw it in the interface. And so
yeah.
too many people thinking I'll just throw it in the interface causes.
Yeah, I think you might get this out of laziness or not knowing where
or
something should go instead of
too many chefs in the kitchen.
That too. All right, so the next one is kind of interesting because it's actually like a UI GUI anti-pattern and not really a
this is software design subsection, so it's not we're not technically in the programming section.
Yeah, I guess so.
I mean, as a designer, you would choose to design your GUI this way.
Or input assistance such as dropdowns.
Yeah, so this one's weird because I feel like even having the validation on the crap, I forgot what the actual thing, what it actually said, but even if you have dynamic validation, like say as you're typing a password, it's validating that it's a certain password strength. Whenever you create that password or say submit, you're still going to want to validate the form that you're submitting before sending it to the server and then doing another validation on the server. So, and I think one of the parts in this magic push button thing, maybe it's in my notes.
I think this one implies that there's actually a ton of fields that you need to set.
That's how I read it.
And there's no validation or hints on any of them.
Right.
And then there's just this submit button at the bottom. And so you've spent 2 minutes filling in this form with no feedback, and you hit the submit button and it just says like error.
All of a sudden you get back like last name or first name can have no.
Yeah, I guess I see that part of it. That part of it makes sense, and that's definitely something you would want to do. You don't want to wait till they've inputted all this junk to tell them that, hey, you messed up somewhere.
Like your password must be 8 characters or more long, but it doesn't tell you that until you press OK.
Right. I see that part. And then there was another part on it, though, that said something about, temporal coupling was the big issue that I kept talking about, which means that basically you're making different parts of your logic has to happen in a certain sequence. So the submit button has to happen after you've entered all these different fields. And if it doesn't happen in that certain order, something could go wrong. But I feel like that validation still has to happen when you hit the submit button.
Interesting. So having required fields, but then not having technically having your submit button enabled when those fields aren't even filled in yet that's how I kind of read as the temporal coupling thing. The way you described it.
Yeah, I guess so.
That's a weird one. That seems like another one that somebody wrote software super quick just to do a function and got it out the door. And then with, I guess, every intention of coming back and making it, production ready.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think this anti-pattern's name makes a lot of sense. I mean,
magic push button. Yeah, that doesn't.
With that temporal coupling problem that you guys were talking about. I mean, you can only push the button, I think, at the end, and so whatever happens before you push the button, which is the name, like, it shouldn't matter. Maybe there's 2 anti-patterns here. One is there's no UI feedback, and then the other one is, I don't know, whatever that coupling thing is.
Yeah. Okay, so we can go to the next one. Race hazard. This one's kind of along the lines of the temporal coupling.
I don't know if this one is an anti-pattern either. I mean, you're not going to ever write code to encounter a race condition or to. I mean, that's not something you're
Well,
going
so
for.
it's failing to see the consequences of events. So this happens all the time when you're doing threading stuff. Like you don't foresee, like you think that you can async these two things, but in reality,
you have like a file uploading that's very large, and it's sitting there churning on the upload, and then you didn't think about what happens when the person presses cancel. That's like the first idea that came in my head here. And those are two events that are absolutely going to interfere with one another, but you didn't even think about what you do once the cancel's pressed, or something like that. Does it seem like it fits it to anybody else?
I mean, I get the concept. I just don't see this as a pattern you'd implement. I mean, all of these are patterns you kind of implement, whether you mean to or not. You're not.
Well, these are design, right? So we can't think about like writing. I guess ideally,
Okay.
you're probably not thinking about writing the code. You're like drawing it all on a board, and you're like, oh, the person will just press submit here, and then if they press, and then nobody talks about what happens when they press cancel. And so that when it does get implemented, then you start having these crashing of events. Like I'm trying to step away from the programming and think about only when people are talking about design on a whiteboard.
I just see this the same, similar as a input kludge. It's you're forgetting or not doing something.
Yeah, all of these are poor design. All of these are by people who design things poorly. That's what I'm trying to say.
Okay.
These
Yeah,
don't by definition of anti-pattern, these seem like straight up mistakes, not like things that people would do on a common basis. And then
yeah, I feel like the whole software design. Now thinking about it, hearing you talk about it, Justin, the software design section doesn't really fall in line with design patterns if we think of them as the opposite of the design patterns that you think of.
yeah,
I think the database as interprocess communication could maybe be one.
mm-hmm.
Maybe interface bloat.
Yeah, I'd be interested to skip down to programming and talk through that one, and then possibly come back to OOP.
Skipping down to like right now, that's fine.
Well, I mean, we're done. We finished. We've almost finished the software design, and I think software design has proved itself to be less anti-pattern than we'd like to talk about.
Yeah, that's fine.
Fair enough. So programming, you want to go to that?
Yeah.
Okay. Accidental complexity.
Oh, this one's long. Let's do half.
Programming tests which could be eliminated with better tools, as opposed to essential complexity inherent in the problem being solved. Accidental complexity. So trying to. I was going to go with one example, but I don't want to give that example. Let me read that. Trying to write up your own serialization methods when instead you could just
use Newton's law.
Use Newton's law is a good example. This is the example of reinventing the wheel. You are rewriting something instead of using a tool that already exists that does the job well. This is something that definitely exists, and this is the first thing that I would say is definitely an anti-pattern by the definition.
I wouldn't. So this one-liner description, I feel like it kind of boxes you into thinking of like libraries and tools, but there's also just different ways to do things. So if you want to do a bunch of if else's versus a switch case,
but that's not any more complex. Would you consider that like a change of complexity, or to me that's just a kind of a different way of doing the same thing? I mean, one may look better than the other, don't get me wrong, but there's not like an inherent amount of complexity added, unless you have, for some reason, you end up with an extensive number of nested ifs somehow. Would you agree with that?
Yeah.
So I mean, I know that this kind of pigeonholed us into talking about libraries, But that's the one that to me that's the one that makes the most sense out of the box.
Yeah, that one's obvious. I think just in general, I mean, so the anti-pattern is called accidental complexity. Anything you do to introduce unnecessary complexity to solve your problem.
Yep.
I had an example. I was writing some JavaScript the other day at work, and I was trying to. What I basically ended up writing is if x is not equal y, do this. But I started out by doing if x equals this and y equals this, do this. If x equals this other value, if y equals this other value, do this. And I was like, wait a minute, I can simplify this to a single if statement.
Yeah, so that's a good example of accidental complexity. I would see this as like writing a long for each statement that in the end maybe filters and sorts some array for you, and you could have just called link and used links, filter and sort, and done it. And that to me, that's using a tool that does the job better than writing a filter sort for you. I mean yourself, sorry.
Yeah, I'm going blank on like coming up with examples for this one because all I can think about is libraries.
Yeah.
Well, think of we covered accidental complexity and necessary complexity in that constructs course. So essential or necessary complexity is you have to write that if statement to handle your problem. If you're trying to validate some data, you have to do some ifs or something.
Mm-hmm.
And then accidental is any ifs or quote something that you don't need because there's another simpler way to do it.
That works.
And so, I mean, programming is abstracting rules, and it's necessarily complex. It's just don't make it more complex.
Oh, this is an interesting one. Oh, actually, I do have an. We've actually the second one, so I assume we've beat accidental complexity into the ground.
Yeah.
But action at a distance is an interesting one because I think we've recently undone this issue in the legacy software, in that some of our machines had direct access to the data access layer, and that is technically a bad thing, and that has recently been split back out so that it has to communicate through our higher layers before any of the data access is actually touched. I wouldn't call that unexpected interaction, but it's unnecessary or something you definitely should do. I'd be curious to see how you get unexpected interaction.
If you told me a media player could query the database, I'd be like, no, I do not expect this.
That doesn't happen like that.
I know. Like it had the data access libs, but those don't actually connect.
Yeah. I mean, they do, but that's not what was happening.
Okay.
Omar?
Yeah, I don't have anything on this one either.
Oh, maybe I should click on it and actually see if they have an example, because that would be a smart idea.
I think under programming, the only one I had was boat anchor.
Array indices normally begin at 0 because the value of sum is normally 0. But if you set it to 1, then arrays start at 1, which makes Fortran programmers happy. So we see examples.
Where are you?
I'm looking at the examples of action at a distance.
Oh.
It's in Perl.
That doesn't even make that example doesn't
Because it's in Perl.
Doesn't seem like it would fit the bill.
Maybe this one's a stretch, but I had an example this week. I was trying to create a user. I was getting an error. And so the code was trying to create a database. Like I wouldn't expect that to ever happen. Why is
You're
that?
creating a user, but it was creating a database.
I was trying to create a user, and in the error handling, the code tried to create a brand new database.
What?
That was happening directly because you were creating a user? For certain?
It was in that stream of I made the user, I got the error, that same bit of code, the admin service was right after the error. Like it was reproducible 100% of the time.
It was trying to create a database.
Yes.
Well, I tell you what, that is an exact example of unexpected interaction. I hope that bug doesn't go into my queue. Holy crap!
I actually didn't add a bug for that.
Yeah, that can't be. There's got to be some. I pray there's something else going on.
I mean, it wasn't a coincidence. It was 100%.
Boat anchor.
Boat anchor.
Of this we do rampantly and widespread.
Yeah, and I feel like this sometimes happens a lot, not out of like negligence or not wanting to take something out, but like because you're trying to keep backwards compatibility or like trying to keep that 1 or 0.1% of users happy that are using this. Because I feel like in our product there's a ton of features that are either not used, no one knows about, or used by like 0.01% of users.
A surprising number of features that exist for people like support and for people.
Well, that'd be fine.
I don't know.
What I would want to take out is like features
like
that like aren't actually being used at all or aren't even.
I think the fear is we can't guarantee that they're no longer being used, and we also can't guarantee that removing it won't break anything.
That second part I agree with. The first part I don't. I feel like we can verify or check that something's not being used. Like you can.
Well, for some things you could go run a query on the database, but
you can see like our features being actually used. Are they not?
I think procedural things and flows on how you get from A to B, you can't get that from the database. You'd have to go look at every single user to see how they use the app.
I think
that's not possible.
One good example that I don't know, I don't actually know the answer to this is whether anybody uses this, but Player has 2 different ways of doing updates. I think there's a sequential way, and then there's another way, and you can change it in a config file to make it do the other type of updating. I don't know if anybody uses the other one, but it exists, and we have to. And when we make changes to updates and things, it gets maintained.
I feel like that brings up a second anti-pattern that I want to skip to down here called soft code.
Okay.
Which is essentially having big configuration files that let you change a lot of things.
Oh yeah. Rather than source code. Well, rather than source code's a weird.
Well, basically, like, you know, I mean, this might be a stretch, like, because I think this soft code, like the actual definition, is talking about having like stored like maybe methods and stuff, and like what does it say?
Oh, the constants is an interesting thing.
Macros and all that, but
yeah,
I feel like there's plenty of flags and like different values that you can change to like completely change how something works. And I feel like there's too much of that.
I don't know if this falls under the umbrella, but I feel like a good use of soft code would be stuff like localizations or translations. I don't think that's code, that's just strings. But somebody said a global file.
Localization?
Localization.
Yeah. Oh. Yeah, I don't think that's...
Oh.
I don't think that would be this. That
okay.
Yeah, that's just string values. This is like changing functionality or changing the way the code actually works, basically.
This is like having a...
Like you set a flag true or false in the configuration file, and that makes a completely different branch of the code execute instead of a different branch.
I don't think this one is as big of an anti-pattern as this Wikipedia page suggests.
Yeah.
I think it's useful.
Well, it's useful to an extent, but and not just with our product. I'm talking about like even maybe I find myself doing this. Like you try to like make something super configurable because you're thinking like way down the line, maybe I'll want to do this or I'll need to do this for debugging purposes or for just for a nice feature to have. If I put it in a configuration, I put a flag in the configuration file. All I have to do is change that. I don't have to change any code. I mean, it has its use cases, but I think it can be overdone, and I think that's what this anti-pattern is.
Okay, so over config filing.
Yeah.
I can get behind that because I feel like there are clear examples of where config file is necessary.
Yeah, definitely.
But overdo it, putting way too much in that file, I can get behind that. I love that the one above that's called Shotgun Surgery, and I haven't read it yet, but I like that that's the name of it.
Yeah. So we can go back up or go to Shotgun Surgery. Okay, so if we go back up, it's busy waiting. I mean, this one's kind of self-explanatory, just consuming CPU while you're waiting for something to happen.
Yep. Did it update yet? Did it update yet? Did it update?
Yeah, so polling over event-based, basically. Yep. Like, don't do polling.
Yeah, I can see how this one would actually, people would do this one, but.
Yeah, so. Yeah, just this, I feel like this one probably pops up commonly just out of, beginners not knowing better or a developer not knowing better. Yeah. They don't know that there's a different design pattern or a way to do that.
It's a bit of the accidental complexity, right?
Yeah, this is a perfect example of accidental complexity where you had this really crazy polling where you check. Oh, I have another. Speaking of that, I just had a really interesting example for accidental complexity, but I don't want to share it.
Is this something you did?
No.
Oh, okay. Well, that's less funny.
Did I do it?
No.
Okay.
Neither of y'all. Don't worry.
I'm about to say I didn't do it for sure.
Facebook.
I'm not even worried.
Yeah. So yeah, busy waiting. I think this one's a pretty simple one. Next one, caching failure. Forgetting to clear a cache that holds a negative result after the error condition has been corrected.
This is just a bug.
Yeah. I kind of feel that way about a lot of these. It's kind of hard to differentiate. Like,
forgetting to clear a cache that holds a negative result. The error condition has been corrected.
I feel like this should be renamed to like common mistakes.
Where's there a scenario where you would cache a failure?
Busy waiting.
Say you have like global variables. If you have a global variable that holds your error code, you catch an exception, set the error code, do something about it, and then your next piece of code starts executing, but you still have the old error code.
Okay.
Maybe if you're validating a login form, the password's not strong enough, or your user creation form, the password's not strong enough, so you change the password, but then you're stuck with that invalid password.
Yeah, because you forgot to.
Okay.
So you have to refresh the page.
Yep. Perfect example. Next one, cargo cult programming. Using patterns and methods without understanding why.
This is called being a brand new programmer.
This is called I just read clean code, or I just read.
Yeah.
What are all the big books called?
I just learned about MVC 7.0.
Yeah.
So here I go.
I just watched a Microsoft video.
Yeah. This one's called being being green.
I feel like this kind of happened. This is kind of they should maybe name this the shiny object anti-pattern, where like a new shiny object comes out and you want to use it everywhere.
I think they're similar, not necessarily the same.
Yeah, maybe not. Maybe this one's just talking about
this is copying off of this is Googling an error, getting a Stack Overflow response and being like, yep, copy paste, and not understanding why it works.
Oh, well, so when I thought of this one, I was thinking like you just heard of the builder pattern and you try to put the builder pattern everywhere, or you just heard of the a singleton or how to do a singleton and you put a singleton everywhere.
I didn't read this last sentence before I said what I said, but here's the last sentence in the definition of cargo cult programming. The term may apply when an unskilled or novice computer programmer copies some program code from one place to another with little or no understanding of how it works. This is literally copying off of Stack Overflow. It's called cargo cult programming. Someone says, this will work, try it out. And you go, yep, copy paste. Interesting.
Yep.
Coding by exception.
Coding by exception. Adding new code to handle each special case as it is recognized.
Oh.
So instead of writing just a few lines to handle 95% of the cases, you're writing hundreds of lines that each handle one case.
Instead of having like 2 catches for very important errors and then a blanket error catch for everything else that may happen.
I don't think this actually talks about like errors. Like it's an exception, as in it's like an exception to the rule.
Yeah, I feel like this kind of this is like spaghetti exception handling, maybe. Because you're saying when I read this, it sounds like, huh? Do what?
Yeah, I see. It does talk about errors, but I do see what you're saying, Omar, where it's like you're like debugging and you trace it back to where all of a sudden the value is null, and you just go, oh, okay, and then you just do a null check, like
if it's null, handle it this way.
You just kind of like inject random checks for things because errors are happening. That would be a prime example.
Instead of knowing what's actually happening and how it's going to work, and then
instead of fixing the root,
writing the code,
all these band-aids.
Right. Okay. Design pattern. The use of patterns has itself been called an anti-pattern, a sign that a system is not employing enough abstraction.
Skip.
What? That doesn't make sense.
So patterns or anti-patterns, and anti-patterns are patterns.
Sign, stop. You're confusing me. I have no idea what this means.
The use of patterns is an anti-pattern. I would assume this should be something like over-designed patterning.
Maybe overusing.
Yeah. It's like you have way too many patterns in your program when you don't need that many. That's kind of how I read that definition.
Yeah.
I also skip.
Yeah, let's just skip it. Even though we talked about it.
Kind of.
All right. Error hiding. Catching an error message before it can be shown to the user and either showing nothing or showing a meaningless message.
Diaper pattern.
I feel like we do that a lot.
I kind of think we do too.
And
this is
I've done this a lot too. Like it's not just legacy code. I've done this a lot too out of like naiveness, and I've since then had to go back and fix bugs because of this anti-pattern.
This is like catching an error and then logging a message like, oh, something happened in the log file, and then continuing on, and then all of a sudden later
so like, maybe mine wasn't actual error hiding. Maybe mine was having exception handling or exception catching too low on the stack of code.
To me, I think we do this a lot with our log handling, and it's like, and we do this if you guys agree, then we do this a lot of places, and it's like, oh, something went wrong, and you just say, and you
just log it.
You literally log something went wrong with no other information, and then you have to reproduce.
The worst is when something bad happens and it's not even logged.
Also true. You have some kind of like return false if this occurs.
Mm-hmm.
And no information is sent out. That would also, I wouldn't call that error hiding. It's more like sweeping under the rug.
Where the error occurs on the server side, it directly impacts the user. The user needs to know that error occurred, but the server is not sending it back to the client.
Well, in
So-
that case, that might be a feature or like on purpose. So
Well-
you usually don't want to send exceptions, or at least not the bare exception. You might want to send
any feedback. And so I'll use the example I brought up
generic
before where you're
feedback,
trying to
yeah.
create a user and then there's an error occurring. I was getting this error on the server. Basically, the user was not getting their like welcome email, but nobody knows that unless you look at the log buried on the server.
Yeah.
Like the user should have been informed.
Yeah. But in that case, that error would have to like be handled in like a very specific message that doesn't give too much to the end user.
Yeah, it would just be a string.
Yeah. All right. Hard code. Embedding assumptions about the environment of a system in its implementation.
Is that like if OS equals Windows 7?
Yep.
Yeah, I think so.
Or saying, yeah, I mean, that's the best example.
Yeah. I don't know that I run across this too often.
I don't understand the negative impact of that.
No, you tie yourself to a platform, or
Yeah,
it's not portable or not.
You write
Okay.
something that assumes you're always going to be on Windows.
Yeah. Or assume you're always going to be on a specific version of
Yeah.
Windows or a specific hardware type.
Version of
Actually,
Python.
now that I think about it, maybe we do kind of
We do this.
a little bit on the Android side because we have a very specific Android player. Because
That's different because our hardware was designed by us. I think that's not something that's gonna. I feel like that's a little different.
yeah, well, I think it's still an anti-pattern because it's gonna hinder us when or if we try to run the app on another Android device that wasn't ours, which I don't think we plan to.
Okay, yeah.
But yeah.
Was that more of a design decision, like above your head, or was that a decision?
No, I think in our specific case, I think it was because of we kind of have to make assumptions in order to to give a very hard example is the reboot. Like on a normal Android OS, you don't have the ability to reboot an Android device. But our custom OS Android version, we have a way to reboot the device, and we have a way. Yeah,
but it was a business requirement that you do that.
Yeah, but it's still an anti-pattern because we're making that assumption that we can reboot a very specific way, and now we can't. Yeah, there's another maybe better example that I don't want to give without.
Stop saying that. I'm curious. I'm not going to give my opinion on this next one.
What's the next one?
I hate lasagna.
Lasagna code.
Programmers.
It's funny when you click on this, it takes you to the spaghetti code page. And I didn't know this, but there's ravioli code and lasagna code, which makes sense when you read the definitions of them. So ravioli code is basically
Interesting.
where you can understand isolated classes essentially, but it's difficult to understand them all as a whole, or like a project as a whole. And then lasagna code is really complicated multiple layer architecture that's difficult to understand because everything's intertwined. So making a change in one layer could break the rest of the layers or have unintended consequences.
Oh, I love the definition of shotgun surgery. We've talked about this before. Whenever we get to that one,
It's almost been an hour.
Yeah, do you want to jump to that one?
We can jump to that one. This is a massive pet peeve of mine.
Okay, let's jump to it. Let's do what you want to do.
About time. So a developer adds features to an application code base which span a multiplicity of implementers or implementations in a single change. So adding a fat feature chunk to the code base and not layering it in there as you work on it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's called shotgun. I'm so glad I know that that's called shotgun surgery now. I hate this. I hate this with a vigorous passion. I hate when people do this.
Why?
Why?
Multiple reasons.
It doesn't give anybody the opportunity to look at it in its infancy and make any kind of comments. So you're relying on that person has spoken about what they're doing enough that everybody already has an understanding, and B, they've attempted to get feedback from people as they were making changes. And if they don't do either one of those, then they're just dropping this fat feature into the project that no one knows a lot about and no one had any input on, and making changes after the fact that could be large and touch a lot of places becomes a huge concern and even more time waste, right? If we had sat and talked about this for 30 minutes before, it wouldn't take you 6 hours after to maybe make a change. So
there's multiple reasons this is bad. I mean,
I would call this programming in a bubble.
The code itself isn't bad, but
well, not necessarily. It could be, yeah, because usually when you do this, it's because of the way you wrote the code. You didn't write it in a way to where you're stubbing something out. Like if you wrote it in such a way where you stub stuff out, like had interfaces and didn't implement them, you could check that in first, and it's a small set of changes, and then next part you would implement one set of that code. Check that in. You could check it in chunks. Basically, you would break it down into pieces. People could code review it, look at it, give you feedback on it. Whereas if you do it this way, it means you're probably making changes or implementing it in such a way to where it's all tightly coupled, and you have to check it in all at once.
Okay.
Where the other way, it usually means that it's not tightly coupled and it's a more modular way of, and more bite-sized chunks. Yeah, so it's just better.
That makes a lot more sense.
You really can't necessarily know the extent of all the features it touches, right? If I check things in waves, it's usually because I'm like, okay, look, here I just made changes to data access. These changes will affect data access. Okay, here's changes to database implementation and our SQL queries. These are going to affect those. So if I wave them in, you know this change set applies to touching this part of the code. And if I body dump this, then it's like, oh, by the way, this probably also touches the API, and it could have some config issues, and who knows if server's still going to communicate. You know, whoever wrote this has to better know all the places it touches. Don't do this. It doesn't even matter. Don't do this.
Yeah, and it's really difficult to. I think I've said this in the past in some of our other discussions. Like, it was difficult to get away from doing this in the TFS world, but now when we're in Git, it's a lot easier to do this because we're going to be on our own branches, and we can make it kind of facilitates making smaller commits and changes and pushing those up to where everyone can see them.
But you're on your own branch. I'm still concerned. I can't say that we're out of the woods.
No. Yeah, I'm just saying the tools that we're switching to are gonna kind of facilitate a better practice because Git by nature.
maybe.
I'm the optimist.
Yes.
Obviously.
Maybe. If I make a huge,
not so much.
I can do the exact same thing if I branch off.
Oh yeah.
And make a massive feature on my branch, and then request the merge for that massive feature. Someone's gonna have to go through all this and be like, Jesus, this touches 50 files and it's 1,000 lines of code. Why is this one check-in? And either that person has to then go try to split it into some weird waves to check it in. It doesn't stop it from happening. It isolates it, where when they try to make their fat check-in and they have to get it approved, we can reject it, which is something we couldn't do in the TFS world. But it does not stop somebody from trying.
Yeah. What the main point I was trying to make is that it facilitates it, because with Git, you're kind of, once you make a small change and you have something working, you kind of usually or eventually you'll get in the habit of committing that and usually pushing that up to the remote repository. And then even if you're not done with it, because it's not hurting anyone else, so you just push it up. And then you make another change and fix it or make different changes on it. You commit that, push it up.
I don't know. This is a topic for another day because
Yeah.
I'm worried about pushing it up to, when you say push it up to the remote, that's still, you're still pushing it up to a split branch that only you are touching.
Right.
And so eventually that branch has to be merged. And so splitting branches per feature set almost facilitates massive chunks coming back into the dev branch when a feature's finished. So it's almost worse, but I'd be willing to talk about that later.
Fair enough.
Maybe I don't know enough, and I pray that I'm just wrong.
Yeah, I think time will tell also.
Yeah.
Alrighty.
So that's, I don't know, 50% of the weird anti-patterns.
I think I want to use the loop switch sequence. That one sounds neat.
Encoding a set of sequential steps using a switch within a loop statement.
That's basically like go-to.
Yeah, that is kind of what that is, isn't it?
It's like go-to, and it's everyone knows go-to is bad.
Oh wow, I would love to see this working. I feel like it'd be watching. It's like watching a steampunk thing twist, as you're watching like a switch turn into or you're watching a loop communicate between a switch. That would be super weird.
Yeah. It'd be interesting to see it in like the assembly that like say C sharp produces if you write this. I bet it would look like go-to statements.
Oh right, once it's actually, yeah. Oh, weird.
All right.
That's fun.
I like this episode.
This was interesting for being exposed to a lot of terminology that I've definitely never heard before. Or I guess I would say giving a name to a bunch of faces, right?
Yeah, I liked it for that. I didn't like the title of anti-pattern. I feel like some of these aren't necessarily patterns. They're just like, I think Jack said, bugs or bad practices or
Yeah, this anti-pattern should have a parenthesis bad development.
yeah.
Anti-patterns being awfully polite.
I guess it doesn't say anti-design pattern, so maybe it kind of makes sense. I don't know. I'm on the fence about it.
So we'll do the other half next week.
Are we? Are we gonna do a part 2 on this? I think we've.
Yeah, we can vote, talk about it, discuss,
I
fight.
think it'd be a lot shorter. Maybe.
Okay, that's topic for another for an in-between day here.